And that meant in the hands of the man who probably wrote most of the book, namely Louis Wirth, the sociologist from the University of Chicago. If you go to the University of Chicago archives, you will find there that Louis Wirth admits to writing 8 chapters of The American Dilemma. I think he wrote more than that, but I think there were other people who wrote it as well. There are long chapters on the need for contraception among Negroes in the South. Frank Notstein is mentioned as part of the credits of the book. I think Frank Notstein wrote this part because he was an expert on population control. He was a demographer at Princeton University, the teacher of John D. Rockefeller III, who was the founder a few years later of the Population Council. In other words, it seems pretty clear, given the evidence, that it was physically impossible for Gunnar Myrdal to write an over 1,000-page book on a topic which he admittedly knew nothing about within a period of what would have to be 8 months, since he left the country in 1940. The book came out in 1943. So at this point, it seems to me appropriate to shift our attention to Louis Wirth, the sociologist whom I think was basically the prime author of The American Dilemma. On April 10th, 1941, which is to say 8 months before America would enter the war, Louis Wirth presented a scholarly paper on the present position of minorities in the United States at a sociology symposium. The newer European immigrants, Wirth wrote, coming at the time of the greatest industrial expansion, are overwhelmingly concentrated in the larger industrial cities and retain to a much greater degree the compactness of their ethnic communities. In some cases, their colonies in the cities of the United States exceed their numbers in the largest cities of their respective mother countries. Louis Wirth was a sociologist from the University of Chicago, which is another way of saying that he was in the psychological warfare establishment, which at this moment's history, in the nation's history, meant keeping tabs on America's ethnics, which meant, in common parlance, the recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, but the Irish as well. As the inclusion of the Irish indicated, the common denominator among these groups was not geographical, it was religious. Since virtually every group in the United States was an ethnic group, including groups which were involved in spying on the other groups, Wirth had to explain why some groups posed more of a threat to American security than others. To do this, he had to get into religion. A quote again from the same talk. In the face of the numerical as well as economic, social, and political dominance of the Protestant groups, the Catholic population may be regarded, and in certain communities thinks of itself as a distinct minority, especially since in some communities Catholicism is also associated with Irish, Italian, Polish, or certain other ethnic or national origin groups. Whereas the internal division and lack of cohesion of the Protestant denominations detracts from their capacity to play the role of a dominant group effectively, the relative internal unity and concentration of settlement of the Catholic groups in the urban centers increases their capacity to act collectively and develop an appropriate group consciousn's. Although there is no indication that he read it, Wirth's analysis of the ethnic situation is virtually identical with Blanchard's analysis of Bridesburg, the Polish neighborhood in Philadelphia, which was written during World War I, when the intelligence community of that era had similar concerns. The Committee for Public Information, the CPI, run by Frank Creel. The unspoken assumption behind Wirth's analysis, a view which would find expression in Paul Blanchard's book, when it came out in the late 1840s, is that Catholics had a congenital weakness for fascism. In fact, both Blanchard and Bertrand Russell, whom he praises in American Freedom and Catholic Power, would claim that Catholicism and fascism were politically indistinguishable. This was of special concern to the intelligence community because, in Wirth's words, The totalitarian nations of Europe have substantial representation of their subjects or former subjects in the United States, a fact worth emphasizing in the light of their extended concept of nationality. Once again, war was creating ethnophobia in the intelligence community, which worried about the descendants of these foreign-born residents who presumably are at least in part subject to the ideologies of their respective mother communities. Close quote. Once again, the intelligence community was trying to disrupt communications among subject peoples whose populations had increased significantly in the intervening 20 years. One instance of this, which I mention in the book, is the Pole Town in Detroit. One of the Palmer raids, during the 1920s, right after World War I, went to the Polish Union organization in Pole Town, and they found all sorts of literature, but no one could read Polish. And so there was no ability to know what these people were saying to each other. And that alone posed a threat to the people who wanted to know what was going on. The numbers, according to Worth, and the numbers that we're dealing with here of ethnic, foreign ethnics, were impressive. This again is a quote from Worth. Of our total foreign white stock of 38,720,593, more than 1/6 is German and nearly 1/8 is Italian. If we note further that the Italians have the highest percentage of any of the major immigrants unable to speak English, 15%, we have further reason to fear their exclusive susceptibility to news and propaganda purveyed by their foreign language press, which in part has been subsidized by agencies of the mother country's government. But the ethnic facts become even more worrisome when one considers the fact that most of these ethnics belong to one religious denomination. The change in ethnic makeup of the country has brought with it, according to Worth, quote, a corresponding shift in the religious affiliation of the American population, making, quote, the nation now a little over 1/3 Roman Catholic. As if that weren't bad enough, many of these people dominate, quote, certain highly skilled occupations in essential defense industries, close quote. In fact, quote again, some of the key skilled jobs are virtually monopolized by certain groups whose national origin makes them suspect. Whose national origin makes them suspect. Now, Worth never gets around to explaining the criteria whereby he established which nations are ipso facto suspect. But the fact that he included Ireland and Poland on the list indicates that it wasn't just countries at war with the United States. In fact, the only thing which the Irish and the Polish, who viewed each other generally as members of mutually alien races at the time, the only thing they had in common other than American citizenship was the fact that they were Catholic. It was a commonality which existed only in the eyes of the people who considered them a threat, certainly not in the minds of the Polish and the Irish themselves. The tension between the Polish laity and their priest and a largely uncomprehending Irish hierarchy in the American Catholic Church was so intense that it was the driving force behind the formation of the schismatic Polish National Church. The theory of the triple melting pot states that religion supersedes country of origin as the source of ethnicity in the United States after the third generation. If so, then Catholics in America had no ethnic identity at the time Worth was writing about them. The only identity they had was in the eyes of the class which perceived them as a threat. The Catholic ethnics were particularly vulnerable in this regard. They were regarded as a group by the people who wanted to attack them, but they couldn't look beyond the bounds of national origin to prepare a pan-Catholic defense, assuming they were even aware of what was going on at the time. Since psychological warfare demanded stealth to ensure its effectiveness, it was clear that they weren't going to find out what was going on for a long time. Certainly not when the war was going on and the normal channels of communication had been shut down in the name of national security. So at the same time that the German ethnics were being called upon to assert their patriotism and fight in a European war, often, as in the case of Italy and Germany, against their countries of origin, the psychological warfare establishment had targeted them as a fifth column, and therefore fair game for the panoply of whatever black operations the intelligence community thought they deserved.